Hi guys. So I know I told you that even though we read this one and Adelita in school, that I was going to record myself reading it too in case you wanted to hear the story again. So this one is Cinderella, and it was translated and illustrated by Marcia Brown, because remember, this story originally comes from France. So when it was first written, it was in French. So Marcia Brown had to translate it into English so we could read it. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who took his second wife, the proudest and haughtiest woman there ever was. She had 2 daughters who were just like her in every way, bad disposition and all. The husband had a young daughter of his own, but she was sweet and good. She took after her mother, who had been the best in the world. The marriage ceremony was hardly over when the stepmother's temper flared up. She could not abide by this young girl, whose goodness made her own daughters seem more hateful than ever. She gave her the vilest household tasks. It was Cinderella who scoured the pots and scrubbed the stairs. It was Cinderella who polished the bedchamber of Madame and also those of her daughter. Cinderella slept on a wretched straw pallet in a miserable garret up away in the top of the house. Her sisters laid on beds of the latest fashion in the fine chambers, with inlaid floors and great mirrors in which they could admire themselves from the tops of their silly heads to the bottoms of their feet. The poor girl put up with everything. She dared not complain even to her father. He would have only scolded her because, alas, he was tied hand and foot to his wife's apron strings. When her work was done, Cinderella would creep to the chimney corner and sit there in ashes, earning for herself the nickname Cinder Seat. But her younger stepsister, who was not quite so rude as the older one, gave her the nickname Cinderella, and Cinderella she was. In spite of her rags, however, Cinderella was 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, even in their fine clothes. Now, it happened to be the king's son was giving a ball, and he invited everyone who was anyone, including our 2 young misses, for they cut quite a figure in the land. They were delighted with themselves, busy as you please, choosing their costumes and headdresses to go with them. More work for Cinderella, for it was she who starched their linen and puffed their ruffles. Chitter-chatter for nothing from morning to night. But what would they wear, and how would they look? "I," announced the elder, "shall wear my cherry velvet with the English trim." "As for me," said the younger sister, "I have nothing but my usual petticoat, but to make up for that, I shall wear my cloak of flowered gold and my diamond cricket, which is not to be sneezed at either." They sent for the best hairdresser to pile their curls up into 2 horns. None but the best beauty patches would do. They called in Cinderella to ask for her advice, for she had a very good taste in these matters. Cinderella gave them the best advice in the world, and even offered to dress their hair, which of course was what they really wanted in the first place. While she was working over them, they would say to her, "Cinderella, now wouldn't you just like to go to the ball?" "Ugh, you're making fun of me. A ball is not for such as I." "You are right. Cindersea at a ball? Oh, how people would laugh." And they laughed themselves at the very thought. Someone else would have made nests of their heads, but not Cinderella. She was good. She dressed them perfectly. The 2 sisters were in such a twitter of excitement that for 2 days they hardly took time to eat. They strained and snapped a dozen corset strings, pulling them too tight in order to shrink their waists. All day long they paraded in front of the mirror. At last the day arrived. They departed, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could. When she could no longer see them, she began to cry. It was in all her tears that her godmother found her. "Why, what is the matter, my child?" I wish. Cinderella was so choked with her tears that she could not get out her words. Now, Cinderella's godmother was really a fairy, and she said to her, "You wish to go to the ball, is that not so?" "Oh, yes," Cinderella sighed. "Well, just be a good girl," said her godmother, "and I'll see that you go." She took Cinderella into her chamber and said, "Now go into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella ran to look for the most beautiful pumpkin that she could find and carried it back to her godmother. How on earth could a pumpkin take her to the ball? Cinderella could not guess. Her godmother scooped the pumpkin all out, leaving only the rind. That's just the skin of the pumpkin. Then she touched it with her wand, and just like that, the pumpkin turned into a beautiful coach gilded with pure gold. The fairy godmother then took a look at the mousetrap, and in it there were 6 mice. She told Cinderella to lift the door of the trap, and as each mouse scampered out, she tapped them with her wand. Each mouse was instantly turned into a handsome, spirited horse. And there, all in all, was a set of 6 fine horses of beautiful mouse gray. "Now, for a coachman, I'll go and see," said Cinderella. "If there's a rat in the trap, we can make a coachman out of him." "You are right," said the godmother. "Go see." Cinderella brought the rat trap. In it were 3 plump rats. The fairy chose the one that had the most handsome whiskers. When she touched him with her wand, there was a sleek coachman with the most elegant mustache you have ever seen. Then the fairy godmother said, "Now go into the garden. Behind the watering pot, you will find 6 lizards. Bring them to me." Cinderella had hardly fetched the lizards when the godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who hopped up behind the carriage in their fancy lace and held on as if they had never done anything else in their lives. Then the fairy said to Cinderella, "There now, that will take you to the ball. Are you not pleased?" "Oh, yes, but must I go in these rags?" Her fairy godmother had touched Cinderella with her wand, and then her rags changed into a gown of gold and silver, embroidered with rubies, pearls, and diamonds. Then she gave her a pair of little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world. Thus arrayed, Cinderella climbed into the coach, but her godmother charged her above all. "Do not stay a moment after midnight. If you do, your coach will turn back into a pumpkin, your horses into mice, your footmen into lizards, and your rags into riches." Cinderella promised her godmother that she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight. Away she went, beside herself with joy. Now, when the king's son learned that a grand princess, whom no one knew at all, had just arrived at the palace, he ran out to receive her. He offered his hand as she alighted from the coach and led her into the ballroom, where all the company was assembled. Then a deep silence fell over the room. Everyone stopped dancing, the violins stopped playing, and all eyes turned to the great beauty of this mysterious one. Only a low murmur rippled over the gathering. "How beautiful she is." So there's everybody looking at her. The king himself, old as he was, could not take his eyes off of her and whispered in a low voice to the queen that it had been a long time since he had seen anyone so charming and beautiful. The ladies were busy studying her headdress and her gown in order to have some made just like that the next day. If only they could find stuffs as fine and workmanship as skillful. The young prince conducted Cinderella to the seat of the greatest honor and then led her out on the dance floor. She danced with so much grace that people wondered at her even more. A most splendid feast was served, but the prince did not taste a mouthful. He was so intent with his gazing at Cinderella. Cinderella went to sit near her stepsisters and paid them 1,000 courtesies. She shared with them some oranges and lemons that the young prince had given her. The sisters were completely astonished. They did not recognize her at all. So there they are, sitting together, and they have no idea that it's Cinderella. Suddenly, Cinderella heard the clock chime 11 hours and 3/4. She immediately made a deep curtsy to the company and hurried off as quickly as she could. When Cinderella got home, she went to look for her godmother and thanked her. Then she told her how she longed to go to the ball the following night. The prince had begged her to come. While she was telling her godmother, Rocco, come on. While she was telling her godmother everything that happened at the ball, her 2 stepsisters were knocking at the door. Cinderella ran to let them in. "How late you are," she said, yawning and rubbing her eyes, and stretched as if she had just awakened out of a sound sleep. While they were gone, she had no sleep at all. "If you had come to the ball," said one, "you would have been so bored, I can tell you. A most beautiful princess came, the most beautiful princess that anyone could ever hope to see. And she paid us 1,000 curtsies and gave us oranges and lemons." Cinderella was delighted. What was the name of this princess? But no one answered. No one knows. The king's son is desperate. He would give anything to know who she is. At this, Cinderella smiled and said, "She was then so beautiful? My goodness, how lucky you are. Could I see her? Ah, Mademoiselle Javette, lend me your yellow outfit that you wear every day." "Really?" said Javette. "I like that. Lend you my clothes? I should be mad." Cinderella expected this. She was secretly relieved, for what would she have done if her sister had been willing to lend her that dress? The next night, the sisters were off again to the ball, and so was Cinderella, but this time even more splendidly dressed than before. The prince never left her side. All evening he paid her charming compliments. The young miss found this so far from boring that she forgot her godmother's warning. She was horrified to hear the first stroke of midnight before she even thought it was 11 o'clock. She rose and fled lightly as a doe. The prince followed her, but he could not catch up. In her haste, Cinderella dropped one of her glass slippers. The prince gathered it up with the greatest care. Cinderella reached home all out of breath. Nothing was left of her finery but one little slipper, the mate to the one that she had lost. The guards at the palace gate were questioned. Had they seen a prince leave? No, but they had seen a young woman in rags, and she looked more like a peasant than a fine young lady. When the 2 sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had enjoyed themselves again, and if the beautiful lady had been there. They told her, oh yes, she was there, but at the stroke of midnight she fled from the palace. She dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, and the king's son found it, and he did nothing but gaze at it all during the rest of the ball. He certainly had fallen head over heels in love with the owner of this slipper. They spoke truly, for a few days after the ball, the king's son had his herald sound throughout the land that he would marry whosever foot fit the little slipper. First, they tried it on princesses, then on duchesses, and on all the ladies of the court, but it was no use. They brought it to the two sisters, who did their best to force their feet into the little slipper, but they could not. Cinderella was looking on and recognized her slipper. So she said laughingly, "Let me see if it would fit me." Her stepsisters burst into laughter. "Fit you? Cinder seat?" Oh, how they mocked her. But the gentleman who had been sent to try on the slipper looked intently at Cinderella. Finding her beautiful, he said it was no more than right, and he had been ordered to try it on all of the young ladies. He had Cinderella sit down, and sliding the slipper on her little foot, he saw that it fit her perfectly, as if it was made for her. The astonishment of her sisters was great, but greater still when Cinderella drew the other one from her pocket. So she kept her other glass slipper. I think that was a good idea. Then suddenly her godmother appeared. Touching Cinderella's rags with her wand, she changed them into a costume still more magnificent than she had ever worn before. Now her stepsisters recognized her. Cinderella was the beautiful person that they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet and begged her for forgiveness for all their bad treatment. Cinderella asked them to rise, embraced them, and told them that she forgave them with all of her heart. She begged them to love her as always. Hold on. Rocco wants to get in the video too. Cinderella was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was. He found her lovelier than ever, and a few days afterward, he married her. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her sisters a home at the palace, and on the same day married them to two great lords of the court. Wow. So Cinderella was very sweet. Even after all the bad treatment that the stepsisters gave her, she still treated them with love and with kindness. All right, I hope you enjoyed that one.